You stand among the crowd as the smoke of pine torches curls into the gray northern sky. The air is heavy with the scent of pitch and sweat, the sound of drums pounding like the heartbeat of a monster. Before you, the funeral ship of a dead Viking chieftain waits, its carved dragon head leering at the sky. The people murmur prayers to Odin and Thor, but your attention is pulled to the young girl standing barefoot beside the bier. She cannot be older than 16. Her eyes dart wildly, as if searching for an escape that does not exist. Then the crowd grows silent. A priest asks her the question that seals her fate. Which of you will follow your master? Her lips tremble, yet she nods. The decision has been made. She will accompany the dead into the afterlife. What you don't know, what you are about to witness, is not a peaceful farewell, but a ritual so degrading, so violent, that centuries later, historians would struggle to believe it ever happened. The girl is led into a tent beside the ship. You can hear muffled laughter and the shifting of bodies. One man after another enters. Each touches her, each forces himself upon her. They whisper into her ear, "Tell your master I did this for him," as though their lust were a holy gift. You want to look away, but the ritual demands witnesses. The tent flaps quiver with movement, with muffled cries that sound less like consent and more like despair. The crowd cheers as though a sacrifice has been accepted by the gods. You realize, with horror, that this girl has already been transformed into a vessel of collective desire, stripped of humanity before she is even dead. The final moments arrive. His stiff, lifeless body is dressed in fine armor, while she, still breathing, is treated like an object in offering. 6 men enter one last time. Their shadows flicker on the canvas of the tent, grotesque silhouettes that make you sick to your stomach. When they are finished, an old woman steps forward. She is known as the Angel of Death. In her hands, a cord. She loops it around the girl's neck, pulling it tight, while stabbing her with a short blade to hasten the ritual. The girl gasps, kicks, and finally falls silent. The ship is set ablaze, flames rising high, carrying both the chieftain and his unwilling bride into Valhalla. As the fire consumes them, you realize the true horror isn't just the brutality of the act. It is the celebration around you. Men and women cheer. They laugh, they drink, they call it honor, they call it tradition, but you know what it is: ritualized sexual violence disguised as religion. In this moment, you understand why Ibn Fad, a capture-only window into this nightmare, reads like something out of a horror script, because it was. And the worst part, this wasn't an aberration. This was culture. This was power. This was the Viking way of ensuring that domination extended even into death itself. You're standing in the great hall of a Viking longhouse, its rafters blackened with years of smoke, the walls echoing with the sound of horns and laughter. The air is thick with mead and roasted meat, with the stink of bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. Tonight is supposed to be a wedding. You imagine joy, celebration, perhaps even love. But the truth that unfolds before your eyes feels less like a union and more like a trial by humiliation. At the center of the hall sits the bride, barely more than a girl. Her gown is woven from bright linen, her hair braided with ribbons, her crown heavy with family pride. She should be glowing with happiness. Instead, her face is pale as wax, her hands trembling in her lap. because she knows what you are just about to discover. Viking weddings were not private matters of the heart. They were public inspections of sexual performance. The priest steps forward with Thor's hammer, Mjolnir's iron surface gleaming in the firelight. He places it directly onto the girl's lap, the gesture unmistakable. A fertility blessing, they call it. But you can see the men's grins, the crude symbolism that leaves no room for doubt. The crowd roars with laughter, some chanting, some pounding their fists on tables. It's not just a ritual, it's entertainment. The groom, red-faced and half-drunk, removes the crown from his bride's head. The hall grows quiet. This single act announces to everyone present that he will now take her virginity. But before they can disappear into private chambers, family members surround them, murmuring prayers and body jokes. Some even place their hands on the bed linens, waiting nearby, as if blessing the sheets where the consummation will take place. You realize with a shiver, this marriage is not between two people. It's a contract ratified by the gaze of an entire community. The couple is escorted to a small side room. You're ushered forward with others, crowding close enough to hear what no outsider should ever hear. On the other side of the door, the marriage bed creaks. The bride's stifled sobs mingle with the groom's drunken grunts, while outside, her family listens in silence, waiting for confirmation. This is no private act of intimacy. It is an obligation, a transaction, a performance that must be completed under pressure of law. When the sounds finally stop, attendants rush in. The sheets are pulled back, examined for blood, and then held aloft for the hall to see. The crowd erupts into cheers, lifting goblets, slamming tables. To them, this is proof not only of virginity, but of honor, property, and political alliance. The bride is not celebrated for who she is, but for what she produced, stain of blood that proves her value. Those sheets are not discarded, they are preserved like legal contracts, sometimes stored for years, to be presented in court should the marriage ever be challenged. Imagine it, your most intimate moment, reduced to evidence in a property dispute. Your body, your pain, your shame, turned into parchment of flesh and blood, in some cases. Family members didn't even leave the room. The sagas describe uncles and cousins standing at the bedside, watching to ensure the act was completed. Picture the terror of a young bride forced to perform under the eyes of her relatives, her body stripped of privacy, her dignity burned away under torchlight. You feel your stomach twist as you realize this wasn't an exception. This was the system. A system where marriage wasn't about love, but about control, humiliation, and public ownership of a woman's body. Asterisk, you march with a Viking war band as their longships scrape against the pebbled shore. Smoke curls from the village ahead, women's screams already piercing the air before your boots touch land. You think war is about swords, shields, and blood. But with the Vikings, war didn't end when the blades were sheathed. Their most terrifying weapon wasn't steel, it was humiliation. Captured men are dragged forward, their hands bound, their faces swollen from beatings. You expect execution, a quick blade across the throat. Instead, you watch in horror as the victors jeer and circle them like wolves around wounded prey. One prisoner is forced to the ground, his clothes torn away. A warrior raises his knife not to kill, but to cut deep into the man's buttocks, a deliberate slice meant to mimic penetration. The crowd erupts with laughter. It is called a shame stroke, a wound not of the body, but of the soul. In that instant, the man is no longer a warrior, no longer even a man. He has been marked as passive, as conquered, as less than human. But this is only the beginning. Other prisoners are forced to kneel, their captors mocking them with crude gestures, spitting insults designed to destroy them as men. You realize the cruelty lies not in death, but in survival. Because in Viking society, to be labeled sexually submissive is a fate worse than execution. It means dishonor, exile, and permanent ruin. These captives will be released back to their homes not as men, but as broken symbols, living proof that their community has been humiliated. The message is clear. Resist us, and you will not just lose your lives, you will lose your manhood, your identity, your place in the world. But the Vikings did not always stop at symbolism. Sometimes humiliation took the form of unspeakable reality. You see another captive, this one a local chieftain, once a man of power. He is stripped naked, tied to a post before the entire village. Warriors take turns forcing him into the passive role, each thrust a declaration of dominance, each act a theft of his masculine essence. The crowd watches, not in horror, but in grim silence, because they all understand what is happening: a transfer of power, a ritualized destruction of honor. In Viking belief, to penetrate was to dominate. To be penetrated was to be destroyed. This wasn't lust, it was strategy. Every forced act was a weapon as sharp as any sword, ensuring that no man could ever return home with dignity intact. Victims became outcasts, shunned even by their own kin, because their shame infected entire bloodlines. Some chose suicide, plunging knives into their chests rather than live as marked men. Others wandered the wilderness, outlaws without community, living testaments to Viking cruelty. You look into the eyes of one such victim, his face hollow, his spirit shattered. He is alive, but everything that made him a person, his honor, his pride, his standing, has been burned away. This is psychological warfare, perfected centuries before the term existed. The Vikings understood that armies could be rebuilt, lands could be reclaimed, but shame could last generations. By sex itself, they turned war into something far darker than conquest. They turned it into annihilation of the human soul. You step into the bustling slave market of Dublin, one of the largest hubs of Viking power. The noise overwhelms you at first, iron chains rattling, merchants shouting, the guttural rhythm of Old Norse mixing with the cries of captives. But as your eyes adjust, you realize the horror before you isn't just commerce. It's the industrialization of human intimacy. Men, women, and even children are displayed like livestock. Traders pry open mouths to show teeth, strip bodies naked, to assess muscle tone, and argue loudly over prices, as if they were bargaining for cattle. But listen closely, and you'll hear the true priorities. The most attractive women are auctioned first, reserved for warlords and chieftains. They aren't spoken of as people, but as bedgoods. Their worth isn't measured in strength or skill, but in beauty, in youth, in the softness of their skin. A girl no older than 15 is pulled onto a wooden platform. She trembles as a man runs his hand across her thigh, squeezing like a butcher, testing meat. The crowd laughs, some shouting obscene suggestions. A war leader pays in silver, leading her away on a chain. Everyone knows her fate. She won't see home again. She won't have rights, or voice, or choice. Her body has already been sentenced to years of degradation. The sagas don't even disguise it. They speak casually of earls who kept harems of Irish captives, rotating them as though they were cups of wine to be passed around at feasts. One saga mentions Earl Sigurd of Orkney boasting about his collection of slave women as if they were trophies. Archaeological evidence confirms it. Viking settlements show a staggering percentage of their population were slaves, many taken specifically for sexual exploitation. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a system, a machine designed to strip human beings of dignity and convert them into tools for both labor and lust. Every chain clinking in that market is a death knell for freedom. Every coin exchanged is a contract for lifelong violation. And the most chilling part, the buyers see nothing wrong. To them, this isn't evil. It's business as usual. You follow the caravan of captives to a Viking longhouse. The air is heavy with smoke, meat roasting, and ale spilling. But behind the loud laughter and clashing horns lies another reality. Slaves are herded into a dark chamber at the back, where the rules of society no longer apply. A free man can do whatever he wishes here, and no law will stop him. The Icelandic law codes are blunt. Raping a free woman could mean death, but raping a slave, that was treated like damaging someone's property. Imagine being a woman in that chamber, your body considered less valuable than a wooden cart. Resistance meant beatings or death. Compliance meant survival, at least for another day. You see one of the captives, her eyes dull with resignation. She doesn't scream anymore. She knows it changes nothing. She will be used tonight, tomorrow, every night, until she collapses from exhaustion or is replaced by someone younger. Her body has become a battlefield where no victory is possible, only endurance. The men boast openly about their rights. They toast with horns of ale while mocking those who show compassion. To them, enslaved women exist to feed appetites, domestic and emotional. If one dies in childbirth, another will be captured to take her place. There is always another raid, another village to burn, another girl to chain. The psychological cruelty is deliberate. By denying slaves any legal recognition of humanity, the Vikings created a two-tier system so brutal that it terrified entire regions into submission, preferring tribute over the risk of their daughters ending up in chains. Sexual violence became not just an after-effect of war, but a weapon of conquest, an unspoken threat, more terrifying than fire or steel. As you leave that longhouse, the sound of muffled sobs lingers behind you, mixing with the drunken laughter of warriors. And you realize the truth. The Vikings didn't just conquer lands. They conquered bodies, and through them, they conquered souls. Asterisk, you're invited to a Viking wedding, and for a moment, it feels like stepping into a festival of joy. The longhouse is draped in woven tapestries, the air thick with smoke from burning pine, and the pounding rhythm of drums shakes the earth under your feet. Guests are laughing, drinking, spilling mead on furs, and clapping as the bride and groom are presented to the crowd. Noise, ritual, but then the tone shifts. As you watch, you realize this isn't just a wedding. It's a contract, a public spectacle that binds not only to individuals, but to families, to lineages, to financial arrangements. And the centerpiece of this contract is sex publicly verified, legally enforced, witnessed by family members who have no intention of leaving until proof is delivered. A priest places Thor's hammer on the bride's lap, his words echoing with double meanings. Everyone laughs knowingly. The symbolism is so blatant it hardly requires explanation. Thor's hammer is fertility, virility, and power, all compressed into a gesture that turns the bride's body into an object of transaction. Then, as the bride's crown is removed, the audience erupts in cheers. Everyone understands her virginity is about to be claimed. You feel your stomach churn. The joy you thought you were witnessing is actually tension, sharp as a blade. This woman's body isn't hers tonight. It belongs to the contract, to the law, to the eyes of dozens who wait impatiently for the act to be completed. For the bride, there is no escape. The walls of the longhouse may as well be the bars of a cage. Night falls, and the climax of the ceremony begins. The couple is escorted to their bed, not in privacy, but in ritual. Torches light the chamber, and family members crowd close to the door. Some even stay inside. You hear whispers, the shuffling of bodies positioning themselves to ensure they don't miss a single sound. Imagine it, your in-laws waiting outside the bedroom, straining to hear your cries, ready to examine the sheets by dawn. The bride lies stiff, her face pale, while the groom is urged forward with cheers, like a soldier pushed into battle. There's no tenderness here, no intimacy, only obligation, performance, and proof. If the bride fails to bleed, her family risks losing the dowry. If the groom fails to perform, his honor collapses, and the union can be declared void. Every touch, every movement, is judged against the weight of legal codes and ancestral expectations. At dawn, the bed sheets are carried out like evidence. In a courtroom, stained linen is lifted for all to see, a grotesque display that determines the success of the union. These sheets might even be preserved, folded away as legal documents, ready to be presented in court decades later if disputes arise. The shame could destroy entire families. You realize the truth as you watch the crowd nod in satisfaction. This isn't a wedding, it's a trial, a public examination of private flesh. Love has no role here. Choice has no role here. Intimacy is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is proof that a bride's body can bleed, proof that a groom can dominate, proof that the community has been entertained and the contract sealed. And you leave the hall with a single thought echoing in your mind. In Viking society, even the sanctity of marriage wasn't sacred. It was spectacle. Asterisk, you arrive at a Viking funeral, expecting solemn chants, quiet prayers, and grieving relatives. Instead, what you witness feels more like a nightmarish festival. A great ship has been pulled onto the shore, its hull filled with the dead chieftain's possessions, swords, shields, horses, even dogs slaughtered to accompany him into the afterlife. But the centerpiece isn't the weapons or treasure. It's a living girl, a slave who has volunteered to follow her master into death. The atmosphere is thick with alcohol and expectation. Warriors drink heavily, shouting songs that praise the dead man's conquests. Women wail rhythmically, tearing their clothes, pulling their hair, as if grief itself must be performed. Then your attention is drawn to the girl. She's young, terrified, and surrounded by men who jeer and press close. One after another, they approach her, not with compassion, but with a ritualized violence that blurs the line between sacred duty and sexual cruelty. They tell her, "Tell your master I did this for him." Each man leaving his mark, each man believing he's transferring his essence to the dead chieftain through her body. She is no longer human in their eyes, but a vesseler bridge to the afterlife. The more men touch her, the more they believe the chief's power will carry on. You watch in horror as what should have been mourning turns into an orgy of humiliation. The girl's sobs drowned beneath the roaring of drunken warriors. By the time night falls, her eyes are empty, her body limp, and the ritual still isn't finished. The Vikings aren't done. They've turned her last hours of life into a twisted spectacle that binds the community together, not through grief, but through collective violence. And you realize, for them, death isn't the end. It's an excuse for cruelty, sanctified as tradition. The final act is worse than anything you imagined. As dawn breaks, the slave girl is led toward the funeral ship where the dead chieftain waits in silence. The crowd gathers, thousands of eyes fixed on her, as if she is both sacrifice and entertainment. She is given one last drink, so heavy with alcohol and herbs that her steps falter, but there is no escape. 6 men enter the tent set up on the ship, each taking their turn in a ritual that has been described in chilling detail by witnesses. By now, the girl is barely conscious. Her body shakes as the angel of death, an older woman assigned to oversee the sacrifice, approaches with a rope and a dagger. You feel your own throat tighten as the ritual unfolds. The rope wraps around her neck, pulling tight, while the blade pierces her flesh. She struggles once, twice, then goes still. The crowd erupts in chants as the body is laid beside the chieftain, arranged like a final offering. Torches are lit. Flames crawl up the sides of the ship, devouring wood, cloth, and flesh alike. The smoke rises into the sky, thick and black, carrying with it the smell of burning hair, skin, and blood. For the Vikings, this is victory. A chief entering Valhalla, accompanied by a woman whose body has been desecrated in every possible way, transformed from slave to sacred gift through violence. For you, the scene is unbearable. What kind of society demands this level of cruelty just to honor the dead? What kind of people cheer as life is extinguished in agony? You look into the faces of the crowd and see no shame, no horror, only pride. To them, this is the highest form of loyalty, the greatest honor a woman could achieve. To you, it is a nightmare, etched into memory, and as the flames consume the ship, you realize the truth. The Vikings didn't just conquer with swords. They conquered with rituals that destroyed the human spirit and turned suffering into theater. Their funerals weren't about remembrance. They were about domination of life, of death, and of every soul caught in between. Asterisk, you walk into a Viking hall and immediately notice something strange. The women at the high table sit tall, their hair braided with silver threads, their gowns embroidered with gold. You realize with shock that free Viking women enjoyed rights unheard of elsewhere in medieval Europe. They can inherit land, manage trade routes, even divorce husbands who fail to please them. One saga tells of a wife who discarded her husband simply because his clothing was too feminine. Another records a woman leaving her husband for being too gentle in bed. This for equality. This wasn't freedom for all women, it was privilege for the few. Because as your eyes leave the shining figures at the table and drift into the shadows of the hall, you see another kind of woman. Slave women, heads bowed, bodies wrapped in rough wool, eyes glazed with exhaustion. To these women, no right exists, but raping a slave carried only the penalty of damaging someone's goods. 2. The Vikings. Enslaved women were livestock with wombs, human beings stripped of every protection, existing only to be used, traded, or discarded. The contrast is unbearable. At one end of the hall, a noble woman negotiates her dowry like a king. At the other, a slave girl tries not to flinch as a warrior's hand lingers on her body. You realize the cruelty of the Viking system lies not just in what it permitted, but in what it celebrated. By elevating free women's rights so high, it magnified the degradation of slaves. The system itself shouted, "See what you could have been, and see what you are instead." This wasn't equality. This was a weaponized contrast that turned gender into another battlefield of power. They could manage estates, divorce husbands, and even propose marriage. Meanwhile, enslaved women couldn't refuse any advance. They couldn't speak in court. They couldn't even keep their children, because babies born to slaves automatically became slaves too, fueling a never-ending cycle of exploitation. Archaeological digs in Dublin show that as many as 30% of the population were slaves, many of them women captured specifically for sexual use. Viking raids on Ireland and England weren't just about treasure, they were about flesh. Women became currency, bought and sold in markets like York or Hiddeby, often paraded naked before buyers who inspected their bodies as if choosing livestock. And here lies the darkest truth. Viking women themselves, the free ones at the high tables, participated in this system. The sagas describe wives who encouraged their husbands to enslave captured women, reminding them that dominance was a mark of honor. Some even mocked rivals by pointing out how many slave girls they commanded. Freedom for Viking women wasn't universal, it was built on the backs of enslaved sisters whose suffering ensured the privileges of the elite. Imagine the psychological torment of a slave girl watching her mistress exercise rights she would never taste. One could refuse a husband for being too weak, while the other couldn't refuse a stranger's hand on her body. One could inherit estates, while the other was treated as part of the estate itself. This wasn't progress. This was cruelty dressed in gold. The Vikings managed to create a society where women could simultaneously be powerful landowners and powerless chattel, where liberation for the few sharpened the chains of the many. And as you watch the hall, the laughter of the free women rings. Louder because it is built on silence, surrounded by warriors boasting of their conquests. Not just the lands they've raided, but the lovers they've taken. At first, you think the Vikings were surprisingly open. Men brag about bedding both women and men, recounting nights in distant ports where ale flowed. You wonder if this society, so drenched in blood, might have been strangely progressive about sexuality. But then you hear the catch, the brutal rule that made everything turn dark. It didn't matter who you slept with. It mattered how. The Vikings lived by one terrifying sexual hierarchy. The active partner retained honor, while the passive partner lost everything. If you penetrated, you were celebrated. If you were penetrated, you were destroyed. The insult of being called arger, unmanly, passive, was so severe that Viking law allowed you to kill the person who accused you, and no punishment would follow. Imagine that. Someone says you were submissive, and you could legally plunge an axe into their chest. That's how dangerous these words were. Suddenly, every laugh, every boast in that hall carries a sharp edge, because beneath the drinking and bragging lies constant paranoia. Every man here knows his reputation could shatter in an instant. A whispered rumor, an accusation shouted in anger, and his entire identity collapses. He'd lose his legal rights, his property, even his weapons. His name would be spat upon, his family disgraced. He would be no longer considered a man, but something worse than an enemy, an unworthy outcast. And in a culture where honor was survival, that was worse than death. You watch the way men glance at one another, laughing too loud, flexing their arms, making crude jokes. It isn't just fun, it's defense. They are desperately proving they're dominant, terrified of being painted as submissive. Every joke about another man's softness carries the weight of a potential blood feud. Every taunt is a spark that could ignite murder. In Viking society, masculinity wasn't a given. It was a battlefield you fought on every day, even in bed. Now imagine the consequences when accusations stuck. Picture a warrior returning from a raid, scarred and bloodied, only to find whispers spreading through his village. Perhaps a rival claims he submitted to another man. Perhaps an enemy, before dying, spat the word arger at him. Suddenly, his life unravels. He is barred from testifying in court. He cannot inherit his father's land. He cannot carry weapons. Overnight, he is transformed from respected warrior to social corpse. The sagas tell of feuds that erupted from such accusations. Sanire families slaughtered because one man questioned another's masculinity. Eagle's saga describes warriors traveling hundreds of miles to avenge insults about their sexual roles. Blood soaked the earth because a single word had been spoken. And it wasn't just men who used this weapon. Women, too, wielded it with devastating precision. A wife could ruin her husband by publicly questioning his performance in bed. The sagas describe wives who stood in public gatherings and declared their husbands too gentle or too soft. In an instant, the man's reputation collapsed, and blood feuds began. This obsession with dominance poisoned every relationship. Intimacy became a constant test of masculinity. Men didn't just make love, they proved power. Women didn't just choose husbands, they judged warriors. And men who dared to blur these rigid lines, who perhaps truly loved other men, faced annihilation. There were no safe spaces, no acceptance, no private lives, only a rigid code that turned desire into war and love into a death sentence. The psychological toll is unbearable to imagine. You see a man laughing with his comrades, boasting loudly, but inside, he's terrified. He knows that one slip, one rumor, could end him. You see a woman smiling beside her husband, knowing she has the power to destroy him with a single accusation. And you realize that in this society, sex was never about connection, it was about control. The Vikings created a world where masculinity was a blade that could cut you down at any moment, where love could turn into execution, and where dominance was the only currency that mattered. In that world, even the gods weren't safe. Loki was mocked for bearing children. Odin himself was accused of unmanliness for practicing a feminine form of magic. If even gods could be shamed, what hope did mortal men have? Asterisk, you find yourself standing on a cold riverbank in the year 922 AD, watching a Viking funeral unfold. At first, it looks almost beautiful. The funeral ship gleams with carved wood, treasures glitter in the torchlight, and chanting fills the night air. You think this might be a solemn farewell, a grand tribute to a fallen leader. But then you see her, a young slave girl, trembling, her eyes darting from warrior to warrior. She has been chosen to join her master in death. The moment freezes you. This isn't a voluntary act of devotion. It's a death sentence, dressed as honor. Over the next 3 days, she is paraded through the camp like a vessel of ritual. Men approach her, not with comfort, but with entitlement. Each one whispers the same phrase, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." It's grotesque theater. They believe they are channeling their life force into her body, loading her with power to deliver to the afterlife. You watch in horror as this ritual unfolds again and again. She drinks heavily, numbed by alcohol, drugged with strange herbs, her body reduced to a conduit for male ego. On the day of the funeral, the angel of death, an old woman draped in black, leads the girl toward the waiting ship. 6 men follow, each one claiming their right to her body one last time. The crowd doesn't avert their eyes. They watch with the fascination of spectators at a play. You can hear her muffled sobs, the chants rising louder to drown them out. And then, the final act, the cord around her neck, the knife piercing her flesh, her body collapsing beside her master's corpse. Torches ignite the ship, flames roar upward, and the crowd cheers as if witnessing triumph. For the Vikings, this was transcendence. For you, it's raw horror. The girl's final screams are silenced by fire and smoke, her existence erased, her suffering disguised as glory. The smell of burning flesh mixes with pine wood and incense, and you realize this wasn't a funeral. It was a spectacle of dominance, a reminder to every slave, every woman, every child, your body, your life, even your death, belong to power. Asterisk, you can't look away as the flames consume the ship. And yet the worst part isn't the death itself. She's a vessel of honor. Her torture is repackaged as sacred ritual. They chant, she goes with him to Valhalla, believing she carries the tribe's collective strength to the gods. But you see her for what she truly is, a human being erased for the sake of male legacy. The saga accounts and Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness report confirm this horror wasn't an isolated event. Across Scandinavia, burial mounds and ship graves reveal the same story: young women, often in their teens, buried beside powerful men, their bones bearing signs of violence. Some had been strangled, others stabbed, their bodies contorted into death poses that don't belong to peaceful burials. Archaeologists now whisper the truth. These weren't companions, they were sacrifices. The psychological violence is staggering. Imagine being a slave girl, watching such a funeral, knowing your turn could come. Each time a chieftain fell ill, you would wonder, will they point at me next? nights spent in dread, praying to be invisible, to not be chosen for honor. And yet, when chosen, you would be expected to smile, to nod, to step forward with false pride, because refusal meant torture, humiliation, and death anyway. The ritual itself reveals everything about Viking society. Sex and violence weren't separate. They were fused into one tool of control. Men asserted dominance, not only in life, but even in orchestrating the deaths of others. Sexual assault became a gateway to execution, and execution became a public festival. It blurred the line between faith and cruelty, turning religion into justification for brutality. And the most chilling part, this wasn't done in secret. It was staged for everyone to see. Children, wives, elders all gathered to watch, to internalize the lesson. Power is absolute. Resistance is futile. Your life is disposable. Your death is entertainment. You walk away from the riverbank with the fire still burning behind you, smoke blotting out the stars, and you realize this was the Viking idea of eternity. To them, immortality was purchased with blood and sex. To you, it looks like the darkest carnival of cruelty in human history. Asterisk, you think you've seen the worst of Viking cruelty. But then you arrive at a village square where justice is about to be carried out. At first, you expect something straightforward: a thief hanging from a rope, or a traitor beheaded by an axe. But no, the Vikings didn't settle for simple death. They turned execution into entertainment and humiliation into spectacle. The condemned man is dragged forward, bound but not beaten. Instead, he is stripped naked in front of the entire community, men, women, children, all watching. You hear the laughter, the taunts, the jeering voices rising like a chorus of cruelty. A priest steps forward, not to grant last rites, but to announce the man's crime in graphic detail. And then it begins. The punishment isn't to kill him quickly, but to destroy him as a man first. If the crime is adultery, he is castrated before the crowd, his screams drowned by laughter. If it's rape, he may be tied down and publicly violated. In the same way, he degraded his victim, the crowd cheering at the irony. If it's betrayal, shame is piled upon him through sexual humiliation symbols carved into his flesh, his body posed like a grotesque warning to others. You notice something chilling. This isn't chaos, it's ritual. The crowd follows rules. The punishment is carried out step by step, as if rehearsed. Children sit on their father's shoulders, watching their first lesson in Viking justice. Women whisper, not in protest, but in fascination. And all the while, the condemned becomes less human, reduced to an object, a plaything for cruelty masquerading as law. The final act is always the same. The man is killed, but not until he has been broken. His body is left displayed, twisted, mutilated, sometimes in sexually grotesque ways, as a message carved in flesh. Justice wasn't about balance here. It was about fear. It was about reminding everyone that Viking power wasn't only physical, it was intimate, invasive, and absolute. You walk away with the sound of laughter still echoing behind you, realizing this wasn't punishment, this was theater, a carnival of cruelty dressed as law. You return the next day, thinking the horror might fade in daylight. Instead, you find the execution site transformed into a festival ground. The mutilated body is still there, hanging, but the people treat it like decoration. Vendors sell mead. Children run around, pointing at the corpse with morbid curiosity. The line between punishment and entertainment has vanished entirely. Historians later describe Viking legal codes as precise and structured. But what you've witnessed is closer to sadistic performance art. Crimes weren't simply punished, they were reversed in grotesque ways. The thief's hands nailed to a wall, the liar's tongue cut out and displayed, the sexually deviant turned into a public spectacle of the very crime they were accused of. It wasn't about justice. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy where power could strip you not only of life, but of dignity. As you leave, you glance back one final time. The corpse still hangs, twisted into mockery, and you understand this wasn't justice at all. This was indoctrination, a culture teaching itself over and over again that cruelty is power and power is survival.